Hello, chap here, and welcome to part 2 of my nerdy series on the French 1867 system. Now, in part 1, I focused on the origins and the mechanical features and where they come from, and maybe they come from other places than you think you do, comparing it to the Snyder patent, for example. And this time, we're going to be a bit more general, discover why it was adopted in the first place, and take a look at the system and also what modifications were done in the very brief period that it was issued. And of course, we're going to take it shooting. So let's get started. As with most of these historical guns, we need to clarify the context of the adoption. Now, unlike many breech loading conversions of the time, this was not meant as a stopgap while a new dedicated breech loader was decided upon, like the Snyder, Vance, and all that. The French had just a year before adopted the Chassepot 1866 rifle, so why did they bother at all with this? And the reason was that they needed a firearm to equip the Garde Nationale Mobile. Now, essentially, these are lightly trained territorial troops that could be called upon in case of general mobilization. Potentially, this could, in very short order, double the size of the standing army, and they could be used for internal security, peacekeeping internally, border security, and general guard duties, while the professional active army would be fighting the war. Now, the institution itself had existed since 1789 as a government-controlled militia, so separate from the army, and amazingly, it survived the constant transition between republican and revolutionary and monarchical leadership in various forms. And the first commander was actually the Marquis de Lafayette, for our American viewers. Now, at the time, so in the 1860s, men being called up for national service would enter a lottery, and they would have their number drawn at random, and they would either serve in the professional army, this was considered a bad draw, or they could be in the Garde Nationale Mobile, which would be a good draw. Why good? Because there's less training and basically did nothing. There was also a system of exchange and compensation for the privileged, of course, who could pay to have their dear son transferred from one to the other where they wanted to be. In theory, training for the National Guard was a mighty 15 days a year. Usually it was actually slightly less, and they would be trained and equipped locally in local barracks, and the equipment and uniform would be provided by the local commune. Usually on a shoestring budget. Now, these troops were not very well regarded by a general population. They're referred to as mobilos, silent T and silent S, by the way, at the end, because French. And so they needed a rifle, and they needed to be breech loading rifle, of course, to equip these mobilos. The Chassepot was ruled out because the national arsenals and the European subcontractors were already working flat out to try and equip the regular army, and of course it had to be something that was really, really cheap. And the obvious solution was some sort of recycling of the standard percussion rifles that had, well, just recently gone out of service. At the time, to my knowledge, there were 4 systems that were tested: the Cornish, which is a Krinker derivative, the Perrin, which is essentially a bolt action, a very bulky one. There was also the Snyder and also the Allen system. Now, the outcome of these trials, as became synonymous with French procurement for decades afterwards, was a cherry picking of features that they liked on the systems they were testing, and thus was born the 1867. In effect, we have a Krinker receiver with an open back, and we have a swing out and sliding breech block with an extractor. Now, that in itself is not the Snyder invention, but clearly the mounting mechanism was inspired by it, as I explained in part 1. So, as I mentioned, the national arsenals couldn't make conversions themselves. They were pumping out Chassepots, and so production of these conversions was just spilled over into the civilian industry, both domestic and abroad. For instance, Belgium, notably Auguste Francotte, produced quite a lot, and the Birmingham Arms Trade also was subcontracted to produce them. Now, of course, the parts of the breech system were subjected to normal proof. They sent out arsenal inspectors to the subcontractors, and they all the parts you will see have the little inspection marks that you would have also in an arsenal produced rifle. What rifles and carbines were slated to be converted? Well, initially there was a set list. So there was the 1853T and 1857 infantry rifles, 1854 Imperial Guard rifle, the 1842T and 1853T dragoon rifles, and the 1859 chasseur carbines. There was also a small batch of musketoons of various patterns. I don't know exactly which ones. Never actually seen one. And I've heard it said that most of the ones that you find, if you find one, are fakes, so watch out. And naturally, all the rifles and carbines that were converted had to be in excellent condition, both inside and out. The conversion itself is quite simple, and I can actually show you here side by side with the original rifle still in percussion. So the barrel is chopped till from about here, and the receiver shoe is screwed on, and then the stock is inletted, but not as much as you would think, and extends a little bit onto the top of the wrist, but side by side it's not far beyond where it would go anyway for the barrel tang. In fact, the screw is still in the same location. And you might think that this weakens the stock, but actually not as much as you think. In fact, I don't remember ever seeing one of these for sale with a broken wrist. One of the advantages of having these back action locks here, typical of the French design, is that the wrist is far chunkier than it would be, for example, on a P53 Enfield. Now, the lockwork itself is completely unchanged. All they've done is that they've angled the hammer a little bit more towards the center line so that it aligns with the position of the firing pin here on the breech block. The conversions based on the fixed-sighted rifles have a little L-shaped flip-up sight fitted. They have a base 200-meter sort of battle sight, and then you can flip up to aim at 400 and 600 meters. Chasseur carbines like these retain their original sights. All right, let's have a closer look. I've taken the action out of the stock for you. As you can see, there's still plenty of wood around the back and underneath, so it's not really any more fragile than the percussion stock. So here we have the barreled action. It is of the first type. It's easily identifiable because it's got these two screws visible. So the first one here is basically a cross pin that retains the axis pin here in the action. And the second one here is to retain the firing pin so it doesn't fly out backwards. The other feature of the first type is this little ball detent fitted on the shoulder here, and that fits into a little recess you can see here, and that's simply just to hold the action shut. Now, in terms of stampings and things, here we've got little inspection marks here on the breech block and here on the receiver. There's also two sets of serial numbers. We've got one here on the back, 455, which is repeated also on the underside of the receiver. I suspect that that is simply a code during manufacture so that the two parts are kept together for fitting, because there is then another serial number, you can see here, G192, which is repeated on the barrel, receiver, also on the breech block, and it is also, if it focuses, it is also here on the head of the axis pin. So I think that is sort of the conversion number for the whole rifle, whereas the other one is sort of a manufacturing serial number. The extractor here is U-shaped, so it goes down here under, and there's a little shoulder machined here, and that acts as a rotation stop, so you don't over-rotate the breech block. And you can see it actually travels a very short distance, but it's enough to extract if you do it with a smartly, then it'll slide out the back and hopefully off up the ramp and out. Now, it appears that at some point the system was slightly refined to make it less fiddly to produce and also to reduce the general number of parts. And what you find in the Type 2 is that the breech block now has a big V-spring embedded in the back of it. And one arm of that is to retain the firing pin, so you can't pull it out. And the other longer arm extends and becomes the locking latch to retain the breech block shut. Now, the axis pin is no longer retained by a screw, but it is itself threaded and it simply screws into place into the receiver. All the conversions that are produced, let's say under normal conditions, maybe not peacetime, but normal conditions, have a steel receiver and steel breech block. The examples that you find that have bronze receiver and or bronze breech block, it's not brass, it's bronze, will have been produced during the Franco-Prussian War when standards understandably slipped due to the urgent need for absolutely any vaguely functioning rifle, and bronze was far easier to cast and even easier to machine. Now, this state of emergency also resulted in an expansion of the types of rifle that were acceptable for conversion, as well as the drop in the quality of the rifles in question. So it didn't need to be brand spanking new anymore. Basically anything went as a donor rifle, and potentially you could find some flintlock muskets that have missed the percussion stage and gone straight to breech loading, and you'll find some flintlock muskets that have been converted to percussion and then converted again to breech loading. Apparently there's also some smoothbores around, so it didn't even have to be rifled. It's just, can it shoot a slug out the end? Yes, convert it. Now, when the siege of Paris set in, and frankly any workshop vaguely capable of metalwork was churning out either rifles or parts thereof, there was further variants that emerged, which are a mix of Type 1 and Type 2. The most variation you encounter is in the locking system. You get lots of locking levers, latches, push buttons, you name it. Involved in this was also Le Faucheur's establishment, which was in the middle of Paris, and they churned out a substantial amount during this time. So what about the ammunition? Well, just to make logistics even more interesting, there are in fact two cartridges for this, one rifle cartridge and one carbine cartridge. Now, obviously they fit in both and will fire in both, but they're intended for the different types. It's now generally known as 18 by 35R, and originally the case resembles a shotgun cartridge. So we have a copper base which has the primer, and into that is glued a tube formed of two wraps of brass foil and then a paper outer sleeve. So the rifle cartridge is loaded with 4.5 grams of musket powder and a relatively light, very hollow Minié which weighs only 36 grams, and the cavity is filled with compressed paper. So it's the only French Minié that has a plug cup of some sort in the base. And the paper wrap for that is generally brown. The Chasseur cartridge is loaded with 5 grams of powder, and we have a 48 gram slug effectively. So it does have a little hollow, narrow base cavity, but that's more to put the center of gravity forward. It's far too small to be a cavity for expanding the skirt. The paper wrap for that is blue, so you can differentiate between the two types. Now, one day I may try my hand at making some traditional foil cases, but for now I use these CBC Magtech 12 gauge brass cases. I chuck them in the lathe, cut them down to 35 millimeters, and also anneal it sort of about to a third of the way back from the case mouth, and just use a forming die and this hand press to form a little neck portion with a shoulder. This has been made by Buddy, our friend Buddy, who obtained a Chasseur carbine sort of a year before I did, and he produced this very nicely finished forming die. So I just had to flutter my eyelashes at him, and I could borrow it. And that's really all you need. The shoulder is about 10 10 millimeters back. Probably depends a bit on your particular rifle. You know, they weren't made to very exacting tolerances. And once you've got that, it's you basically don't need any other tools. The bullet, even in this fired case, goes in with just a little bit of thumb pressure, or I can just use this press if I need to finish off. There's really no real need for crimping either. It's a single shot. And yeah, if you really do want a die set, there is one available at CH4D, but you're probably going to need a lot of patience and a lot of money to get one, and it's not really strictly necessary. So yeah, thanks Buddy for allowing me to use this forming die. Now, since I have the Chasseur carbine, I have of course reproduced the cartridge for the Chasseur carbine. So you can't tell from the outside, but this is the bullet. As I was saying, it does have a cavity, but you can see the skirt here is really thick, so there's no way this is going to expand. This is just engaging rifling, and yeah, the cavity is just moving the COG forward a bit. So it's got nice big deep lube grooves, and so this weighs 48 grams as it should do, and there's 5 grains of powder with a card disc between powder and bullet. Now the mold for this is made by Hensel in Germany. They make excellent quality molds, not cheap, but as they would say, meine Güte, does it cast really well. Anyway, I think we've chatted enough. Let's go to the range. So, as you can see, it is a joy to shoot. Recoil is stout, but it's black powder, so it's progressive. And boy, does it give a good whack on the steel plate behind the target. Now, this is the first time I shot it, so I had to gradually walk it in. But I think now that I know where it's shooting, holding a black shouldn't be too much trouble. Aiming doctrine for these was exactly the same as it was for the percussion muskets they were sourced from. Basically, you were expected to hit a man-sized target, which was 2 meters tall by ½ meter wide. You just had to shoot to hit somewhere on it, and frankly, with the size of those bullets, you can understand why. Simply by aiming at the ammunition belt, the ceinture. And the maximum effective range for these was actually quite sensible and set at 600 meters. All right, you've done well so far. I think you deserve it. Let's go and mad minute this thing. Well, that went as well as I expected it. 6 rounds. It's okay. The windage was bang on, but unfortunately I strung them up and down in my haste. Um, I think I need to also smooth off or straighten a couple of the case mouths after loading, because some of them were scraping a little when being inserted, and scratching was sticky now and again. Now, taken as it is, it's on par with most of the other conversions of the time, and it was certainly good enough for its intended purpose to be used for essentially for home service by very part-time soldiers. Now, the irony is that after the disastrous defeats during the opening clashes of the Franco-Prussian War, both the Garde Nationale Mobile and their rifle are thrust onto the front line, effectively, which was never intended. Hence, it does have a bit of a bad reputation. It's seen as one of the last-ditch rifles that was done in a hurry, when in fact it was adopted before the conflict. It was subject to trials. It was a standard procured rifle. It even has its proper manual of arms. But yes, I think it'll be forever tainted by that bad reputation. In terms of the numbers produced, it's actually pretty hard to pin down how many were made, given that it was a decentralized production to start with, plus we have the ad hoc wartime production. But we can estimate that about 345,000 or so were made, so not an inconsiderable number, and essentially if you want one, you will find one. Maybe not intact, though. So soon after the end of the Franco-Prussian War, the Garde Nationale Mobile is disbanded. It's actually back now in a slightly different form, but although it was deemed a good idea to have some territorial reservist troops, they should be under military control, just like the standing army, and not subject to government control. So with the Guard gone, the rifle is no longer needed, and anyway, the Chassepot rifles are now being produced at a good rate, and of course, not far on the horizon will be the new 100% new metallic cartridge rifle coming, so there's no need for this thing anymore. So the rifles are very quickly surplused and mostly snapped up by Belgian arms merchants, who very quickly also sporterized them. They chop down the barrels, they chop down the stocks, and they convert them to the standard 12 gauge of the time. This is very easily done with a reamer in the chamber, and they also reamed out the bore. So they got rid of the rifling and they reamed it out a little bit further than that. So the barrels tend to be relatively thin compared to what they were as the original form. Some of them were also given racy names, things like Champion or Hunter, or even better, Zulu. In fact, the Zulu has become synonymous with these converted shotguns of the 1867. But ironically enough, these were destined for the US market. So sort of assume that they were for Africa. In fact, they were not. They were for the US. So here we are at the end of this little mini-series. I hope there's only someone there and I'm not talking into the void. So thank you for your attention. Thank you for your support, whatever platform you wish to follow us on. Don't forget, we are also on the app. And I shall see you then very soon, either back here in the workshop or out on the range. Bye.